Lost Orian. There was a time when Orian would make his father and mother very angry. He did grow up to take responsibilities and work around the house and help his father in the fields with crops and in forest with the logs, but he still had that childish string in him. He tended simply to disappear, to wander far away from the village into the mountains to chase the mountain goats, or in the woods to scare the rabbits and catch the badgers. Orian was that sort of a young man that would too often ignore duties of grown men and would simply let his mind wander off to the faraway places, stories and legends, doings of the forest gods and celestial goddesses. Thus, it was no wonder that on a warm spring day, few nights away from the midsummer's eve, he woke up that morning and before anybody could notice him, slipped out of the house, slipped out of the village, and strode into the forest he knew so well. The bird song was loud, the late spring in full blossom, the trees waving on soft wind, their leaves whispering the song so soft and clear in the ears. The bushes would rustle among his path as critters skittered away from him. Filled with those sounds and smells of nature deep in his nose, Orian would instantly forget about those people that worried about him, about any earthly deed or duty. He would just walk and walk, sometimes with his eyes closed and both arms spread wide so he could feel the brush of leaves on his skin. Sometimes with his eyes closed he would walk into a branch and hit it hard, but he never complained or cried. He would brush the pain with a smile. But on that day Orian walked and walked, the bliss of late spring taking him away further and further into the forest where he never wandered before. Still his mind was taken away by nature and he kept on walking deeper and deeper. Tops of the ancient trees, ones that were probably never seen by mortal man, were high, rising proud and blocking the sunlight. He came into the ancient groves where thick moss grew on the ground, making the floor soft and warm as if it was inviting him to sleep on it. He still did not look around as he walked into the glade surrounded by tall oak trees, whose branches blocked the sky, making everlasting dusk. Orian walked to the middle of the glade, where the moss grew thickest, and for the first time that day, for the first time in his life, he felt he wandered into a wrong place. He felt an imposter, an intruder to a place that no mortal man was supposed to witness. He felt scared, fear reaching deep into his heart, panic spreading through his bones. Then he heard a sound. Not the one you would usually equate with nature, but the one that other intruder would make. Orian heard the sound of steps walking towards the glade, walking towards him. For some reason, the thick moss did not muffle the steps of the approaching figure, but luckily it did his. Orian quickly gathered his wits and ran towards the closest oak tree, spreading his arms and reaching it. Soon he climbed the tree, nesting himself on the thick branch and hiding among the leaves, his eyes peeking through them at the center of the glade. And then she approached. Orian knew instantly that she was not a mortal, that she was not of the people that could die. She was a goddess and he knew it. He knew it from the stories told around the hearth, from the descriptions that now seemed bland when he laid his eyes on her. She was more beautiful than any story could describe, that any mortal language could have words to pronounce. She was a goddess, a being not supposed to be seen by mortal eyes, and thus not supposed to be described by them. Orian stared at her mesmerized, knowing that if he ever gets away from the ancient glade, that nothing in this world would ever be satisfying to look upon. Orian gazed at the goddess mortal men referred as Thana, one that separated from the moon and came to walk where animals and humans walked, one that whispered in the woods and smiled on the wind. She came to the center of the glade and stood proud. Suddenly, everything went quiet. All went so quiet that blood flowing through Orian's veins seemed like a flow of a wild mountain river after winter thaw. His heart began to race wildly, and he became afraid that she would hear it. But her mind was somewhere else, as Orian soon saw. Nature stood silent as a primordial being from the beginning of the time walked upon the glade and slowly approached the goddess. It carried a disguise of an animal, approaching her as an elk, one so tall that his horns brushed the lowest branches of the oak trees. His steps were not heard, and Orian knew that this creature was not of this world, even though it inhabited it and walked upon it. The primordial elk approached the goddess and lowered its enormous muzzle towards her. His head was as big as entire goddess, and she lay her hand on it. For a moment, Orian knew that they spoke. They spoke in a language of gods. Suddenly, she stepped backwards away from it and slowly spread her hands and lowered her head. Her cape untied itself and opened like a door. Orian saw another thing he was not supposed to see. From the darkness where her breasts were supposed to be, a throng of spirits emerged. They were many shapes and forms, some just a trace of fog while the others flew like birds. Some were man-made, others created by gods. They flew around the goddess and the primordial elk as Orian watched them mesmerized once again. Their dance was wild and beautiful. One of the spirits wandered away from the rest, one that had a shape of a man-made bird. Her small metal wings scraped as they moved, and they moved the small creature into the leaves where Orian was hiding. He panicked as it landed on his shoulder, yet he managed to hold his voice in check and grip the branch tight. The metal bird turned its head awkwardly and stared at him with its man-made eyes. "Save me!" A female voice emerged somewhere out of it. "Don't let them take me!" Orian stared at her from close by, still trying to figure out how it could have spoken. Then it dawned on him. The stories of Thana had a dark side to them. She protected the woods, and she protected them from those who would dare to enter the forbidden groves. She would take the spirits of those that would cross the line between the woods that were for men and the ones for gods. All those spirits that Orian thought danced around used to be human beings that wandered too far into the woods. Their spirits were taken by Thana and now being brought to and sacrificed to the primordial elk, the one that Thana protected the forest for. The spirits were not dancing, but trying to run away in horror as the magic of the goddess kept them close. They were being swallowed into the oblivion. Orian shut his eyes as the ritual took place. He never saw the primordial elk swallow the spirits that used to be living beings. He never saw where the elk went, and he never laid his eyes on the goddess again. He kept his eyes tightly shut, just hoping that they would never notice him and the metal bird on his shoulder. How much time went by, he never knew. Sun did not shine through the oak leaves. When he thought that long enough had gone by, he still gripped the branch, waiting just in case for some more to pass. Finally, he gathered the strength to move, every bone and muscle in his body aching from the great pain. Awkwardly, he moved and slowly he climbed down. He had no strength to look upon the glade where a ritual of spirits took place. Orian turned his back to it and ran as fast as he could back the way he thought he came from, a metal bird gripping his shoulder, not saying anything from the moment Orian thought he heard the spirit inside of it speak. Maybe he imagined her speak. Maybe she indeed managed to do it. But Orian still ran away from the place where he saw Thana and the primordial elk. As he went further away from the ancient glades and groves, getting closer to the trees he seemed to recognize from his walks, his heart began to gather more strength. The fear was slowly leaving him as a smile crept upon his face. Slowly he started to think if anybody is going to believe his story of what he had witnessed. Orian stumbled out of the forest into the clear ground and rain greeted him. He knew that the village was just over the hill, and with a joyful stride of a person who survived the unthinkable, he hopped towards it. He remembered what his father and mother would be like, angry at him, and for a moment it worried him. Soon that feeling was completely replaced by a shock as big as the one he had on the glade. He stood at the top of the hill, and instead of a village houses, only ruins greeted him. Not a single house was there, and not a single soul. Few ruins were visible, covered with overgrowth that seemed to embrace them a long, long time ago. Shock was even greater when Orian looked down into the puddle of rain close to him, and slightly blurred by raindrops, an image of an old bearded man stared back at him.